नमस्कार, मैं चिराग धनखड़ आपका वाल्मीकि अध्ययन मंडल की ओर से हार्दिक स्वागत, वंदन एवं अभिनंदन करता हूं। मैं आज के हमारे मुख्य अतिथि जे साई दीपक जी, वाल्मीकि अध्ययन मंडल के संयोजक अर्जुन आनंद जी और सह संयोजिका रिया शाह जी को एक साथ मंच पर आमंत्रित करता हूं। आपका स्वागत है सर। वैसे तो हमारे आज के अतिथि वक्ता किसी हस्ताक्षर के मोहताज नहीं है, पर परिचय देने की औपचारिकता निभा देता हूं। जे साई दीपक जी भारत के सर्वोच्च न्यायालय में अधिवक्ता हैं। आप एक प्रख्यात लोक विचारक हैं एवं वर्तमान में देश के बेस्ट सेलिंग लेखकों में से एक हैं। आपकी 2 पुस्तकें इंडिया दैट इज भारत एवं इंडिया, भारत एंड पाकिस्तान एंड द कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल जर्नी ऑफ अ सैंडविच सिविलाइजेशन, भारतीय सभ्यतागत दृष्टि एवं पाश्चात्य एवं मध्य पूर्वी कॉलोनियल विमर्श पर पूरे भारतवर्ष में एक ज्वलंत चर्चा छेड़ने का भागीरथ कार्य सिद्ध किया है। आपका स्वागत है सर। अर्जुन आनंद जी, आप स्पेशल सेंटर फॉर स्टडी ऑफ नॉर्थ ईस्ट इंडिया में पीएचडी शोधार्थी हैं। आप वाल्मीकि अध्ययन मंडल जेएनयू के संयोजक हैं। रिया शाह जी, आप सेंटर फॉर चाइनीज स्टडी में एमए प्रथम वर्ष की छात्रा हैं। आप वाल्मीकि अध्ययन मंडल की सह संयोजिका हैं। मेरा आज के हमारे अतिथि वक्ता जी साई दीपक जी, अर्जुन जी व रिया जी से अनुरोध रहेगा कि वे दीप प्रज्वलन कर एवं महर्षि वाल्मीकि जी के चित्र पर पुष्पांजलि देकर इस कार्यक्रम का शुभारंभ करें।
हरि ओम। श्री गणेशाय नमः, श्री सरस्वत्यै नमः, श्री वेद पुरुषाय नमः। गणनाथ सरस्वती रवि शुक्र बृहस्पतिः पंचैतां संस्मरे नित्यं वेदवाणीं प्रवर्तयेत्। हरिः ओम। मा चंद्रमा मनसो जातश्चक्षुः सूर्यो अजायत श्रोत्राद्वायुश्च पराणस्य मुखादग्निराजायत। स्वस्ति न इन्द्रो वृद्धसरावाः, स्वस्ति नः पूषा विश्ववेदाः, स्वस्ति नस्तार्क्ष्यो अरिष्टनेमिः, स्वस्ति नो बृहस्पतिर्दधातु। भद्रं कर्णेभिः शृणुयाम देवाः, भद्रं पश्येमाक्षभिर्जतराः। स्थिरैरङ्गैस्तुष्टुवागुंसस्तनूभिः व्यसेमहि देवहितं जदायुः। द्यो शान्तिरन्तरिक्षं शान्तिः, पृथिवी शान्तिरापः शान्तिरोषधयः, शान्तिः वनस्पतयः, शान्तिर्विश्वे देवाः, शान्ति ब्रह्म शान्तिः, सर्वगं शान्तिः, शान्तिरेव शान्तिः, सामा शान्तिरेधि। जतो यतः समीहसे ततो नो अभयं कुरु। तन्नः कुरु प्रजाभ्यो भयं नः पशुभ्यः सुशान्तिर्भवतु।
मैं कुणाल यशवंकर जी से आग्रह करता हूं कि वे आज के हमारे अतिथि वक्ता श्री जे साई दीपक जी को भागवत गीता देकर उनका स्वागत करें। रिधिमा सिंह जी से आग्रह करता हूं कि वे श्री जे साई दीपक जी को श्रीफल देकर सम्मानित करें। मैं प्रकृति जी से आग्रह करता हूँ कि वे श्री जे साईं दीपक जी को तुलसी माता का पौधा भेंट करें। मैं वाल्मीकि अध्ययन मंडल के संयोजक अर्जुन आनंद जी से अनुरोध करता हूं कि वे भारत वंदे मातरम संवाद श्रृंखला के विषय में भूमिका रखें।
शतबार शीश चढ़ा दूं, शतबार शीश चढ़ा दूं तो भी ऋणी रहूंगा। जो तेरे काम आ सका तो खुद को गुणी कहूंगा। न मोक्ष चाहता हूं, न मोक्ष चाहता हूं, न मान चाहता हूं। बस हर बार तू भारत माँ हो यही वरदान चाहता हूं। बस हर बार तू भारत माँ हो यही वरदान चाहता हूं। सम्मानित मंच, यहाँ उपस्थित जवाहरलाल नेहरू विश्वविद्यालय की वंदनीय छात्र शक्ति एवं अन्य गणमान्य गण, आज इस सभागार में हम वाल्मीकि अध्ययन मंडल जेएनयू के भारत वंदे मातरम संवाद श्रृंखला के दूसरे संवाद में हम यहाँ पे आए हैं। थोड़ा सा मैं बताऊंगा कि वो क्यों हम इसको करना शुरू किया। हमने महर्षि अरविंद की कुछ राइटिंग्स पे जब चर्चा शुरू की, जैसे भवानी मंदिर या उत्तर पारा भाषण, तो हमें पता लगा कि भारतीय होना क्या है या भारतीयता किसको बोल सकते हैं। Whenever we talk about our civilization, whenever we talk about Bharat as a civilization, what do we mean? तो ऐसे ही कुछ प्रश्नों के साथ हमने सोचा एक संवाद शुरू किया जाए। हम यहाँ पे कुछ अपना ऐसा कुछ थोपने के लिए नहीं आए हैं, हम बस एक चाहते हैं एक चर्चा शुरू की जाए, एक संवाद शुरू किया जाए। और उसमें पहला कार्यक्रम जो रहा वो रहा अ कन्वर्सेशन ऑन द लिविंग डेटी, दैट इज भारत माता, जो हमारे लिए जीवंत देवी स्वरूप है, कोई मात्र संकल्पना नहीं है। और जो दूसरा कार्यक्रम है वो है द मैन्युफैक्चर्ड फॉल्ट लाइंस ऑफ भारत पर, जो कृत्रिम दीवारें भारत की बनाई गई हैं उन पर। तो और ना अधिक समय लेता हुआ आपका धन्यवाद। वंदे मातरम।
मैं वाल्मीकि मंडल की सह संयोजिका रिया शाह जी से अनुरोध करता हूं कि वे अध्ययन मंडल की दृष्टि एवं ध्येय के बारे में हम सबको अवगत करें।
Hello, good evening everyone. So Valmiki Study Circle is an effort to raise discussions on topics and issues of global importance within the Bharatiya normative paradigms in JNU. Since 2019, since our conception, Valmiki Study Circle has been at the forefront of conducting various activities. Some of our flagship events include the Swaraj Pakhwada series, NCRT critical reading series, and also the most recent Bharat Vande Mataram Samvad Shrankhala. We welcome you all. If you wish to join our study circle, please get in touch with either me, Arjun, or Chirag as well. Once again, we welcome you all. Thank you so much.
और समय न गवाते हुए अब मैं हमारे अतिथि वक्ता श्रीमान जी साई दीपक जी से आग्रह करता हूं कि वे मंच पर आए और अपने शब्दों से हमारा ज्ञानवर्धन करें। धन्यवाद।
Namaste. So, I thank the Valmiki Study Circle for giving me an opportunity to speak with and to engage with and to interact with the bright students of this great institution. It's not a loaded statement, it's an honest statement. So, the idea is to give as many people as possible a shot at me through the interactive session and see if I have the ability to withstand your onslaught. So I will keep this so-called monologue to at best about 25 to 30 minutes, and close to an hour is dedicated to the interaction. Rest assured, I haven't planted selective plants here and there to ask me convenient questions. This will be as open as possible. The only rule of engagement that I observe, and I would request you to observe that keeping with the legacy of your institution, is observe civility in the manner in which you engage. Feel free to ask whatever you think is relevant to the subject. I will respond to the best of my abilities. Should I find myself short of depth and knowledge, rest assured I'll be the first one to plead ignorance. Okay. This subject was chosen largely because I've anyway been accused of being a divisive figure. So I thought, why not divide further? So, I've anyway been given these wonderful certificates and labels over the last few years, ever since I've started my public interactions. There's no point in trying to convince the other side. So I might as well do what I wish to and see how it goes. So I think broadly, the topic is a saransh or a single line summary of the writing exercise that I began about 2 years ago. Let me first give out what I know and what I don't know, so that the audience has a clear picture of what my strengths and weaknesses are in terms of my areas of qualification or areas of experience first. As an engineer turned lawyer, my interest in history has been that of a layperson, and perhaps slightly more than that of a beginner. And fortunately, law as a subject requires me to not just look at the legislative culmination of a particular thought, but the history of the thought itself, its political history, its cultural backdrop, and its religious motivations or political theological, let's say, triggers or seeds, so to speak. There seems to be a lot of echo. Am I audible? Okay. So, around the time of 2019, which I felt was a fairly momentous year, for multiple developments took place in that year, which triggered, I think, a massive churn in this country, and we are still in the throes of that particular churn. I think it started with 5th of August 2019 with, it's not the abrogation of 370 because 370 still stands, it's the amendment of 370. Second, of course, you had multiple developments around November. I think one was the Ayodhya judgment. Then you had, of course, the CAA, which had been in discussion since 2016 at the very least, and even before that. And then, of course, you had the review order in the Saṃvāda judgment, which effectively put pause to the 4-1 verdict of 28th of September 2018. Following that, I think from March 2020, the country and society at large had a lot of time on its hand, thanks to the lockdown, to perhaps revisit and reconsider several of its closely held positions, regardless of which side we were from, so to speak, ideologically speaking. And that period, I think, has contributed to a massive shift in what I would call the Overton window, in terms of people's thinking patterns, in terms of the consumption of the material, in terms of knowledge production and content production. And fortunately, the lockdown gave me the breather I needed from my professional commitments to perhaps put out a comprehensive document capturing my position, which was until then presented through multiple lectures on different topics. So there were several bindus across the board, but there was not a single document capturing those bindus in terms of presenting a master template of what I think about some of these subjects. But what I think about some of these subjects, why should it make a difference to anyone? I'm a nobody, why should it make a difference to anyone? It just so happens that by then a lot of criticism had come. That yes, this gentleman seems to have spoken on several subjects, but is he capable of delivering a book? Because that is the touchstone of academic credentials. So said the gatekeepers of intellectualism in this country. And therefore I had to respond. The good part was, while most people saw each of these reactions and developments of 2019 as disparate events, I felt there was a certain continuum to it and there was some kind of a underlying commonality, both in terms of the cause as well as the reaction. And at one point, I think I've said this before, around the time of the CA, when I referred to India as Bharat in a particular tweet, a student, a master's student of Indian origin studying in the United States basically accused me of being a partisan cultural fascist for using the word Bharat, because the use of word Bharat apparently went against the grain and notion of secularism when referring to India. these were people who fashioned themselves and who thought of themselves as constitutional patriots. So to respond to them in their own language, I had to show Article 1 of the Constitution, which effectively said India, that is Bharat. And true to the ethos of free speech and liberalism that this particular camp subscribes to, I was immediately blocked. Because facts I don't think are palatable. Propaganda is, but facts are not. And that got me thinking. Around April 2020, while I think we were still in rather reeling from the first wave, April 14th happened to be the Ambedkar Jayanti, and there was an occasion for me to interact with a Hindu American audience. I wouldn't want to use Indian American because it was largely Hindu American, and I think predominantly Hindu American. And I'm not sure how many of them actually continue to have any kind of citizenship, so to speak, as far as Bharat is concerned. So during the course of that interaction, I also realized that, or rather I was told, that perhaps it was time for me to seriously give decoloniality as a school of thought some serious thought, and also see how its application from a Bharati perspective could be presented before a larger audience. The other trigger, of course, was the participation in the Padmanabha Swami temple case, which gave me an opportunity to understand the thought process behind the entire episode of accession of princely states to the Indian Union, and specifically in the context of the Travancore princely state. Now, in the process of making the case for the Travancore princely state or its royal family's control over that particular temple, we were forced to look at the history of other princely states and other royal families, from Mewar to Kashi, to the Gajapati of Odisha, to the northeast, to Kashmir and whatnot. Interestingly, most of these princely states seemed to have their own deities, their family deities. So just as you have Ekrimji for Mewar, you have the Jagannath for that particular state, and then you have Chamundeshwari for Mysore. Each of these deities had some kind of a relationship. And interestingly, when they chose to negotiate with the Indian Union on the element of accession, one of their primary conditions that the cultural ethos of their states, as well as their rights over their deities, shall not be interfered with. Now, that made me wonder, if these were the terms of engagement between the princely states and the Indian Union, when did this translate to a secular country? If the constituents of a whole seem to subscribe to a particular religious identity, coupled with the fact that these discussions were happening during the bloody days of partition and post that, are we to believe that the lesson that was drawn post this particular experience was one of secularism? That seemed to be the question that I wanted to address. But this is not a question of opinion, this is a question of evidence and research and fact. Now, that is what effectively triggered the discussion. So largely, the writing exercise has been devoted to understanding the origins of the fault lines that divide this country at this point, from a religious perspective, from a linguistic perspective, from a caste perspective, and whatnot. Now, if we were to accept these fault lines as the existing state of affairs, the question that you would be expected to ask is, what is the causality? What are the origins? Where do these problems come from? Are these internal? Are these foisted by external actors? Or is it a two-way street where an external actor foists it and the internal actor collaborates? These are the kind of questions that I wanted to address. And that has effectively taken the shape of the first two books. What was meant to be a trilogy will now be a tetralogy or a quadrilogy, as they call it. So the first book effectively covers the period from the Columbian expedition till the first constitution for pre-independent India, which is the Government of India Act of 1919. The second book covers the fall of the Mughal Empire from the 1740s to the end of the Khilafat movement of December 1924. The third book will cover the period from 1925 to 1946, when the idea of Pakistan had become a reality. And the final book will effectively cover the period from 1946 to 1950, looking deeply into the cogitations and deliberations of the Constituent Assembly to understand what was the position of the Constituent Assembly on the following issues: Bharatiyata, religion, gender, language, caste, and the relationship between the union and the states, namely federalism. These are the 6 or 7 verticals that I will hope understand as far as the fourth book is concerned. Because the Constitution as a subject is vast, but I am primarily approaching this particular document through the prism of identity, through the prism of civilizational identity. And therefore the idea is to understand whether there is some kind of a tenuous, tense, and strained relationship between the civilization and the Constitution. That is the broad, let's say, lay of the land as far as the books are concerned. One of the things that I have realized during the course of the writing of these books is that the Jati, Caste, Varna crucible is a poorly understood ecosystem. While there will always be a power struggle which is internal, which I think is a function of human psychology, whether the structure itself is meant to be a structure of exploitation, and second, whether this is the fundamental building block of Hindu Dharma. These are questions that I'm trying to understand. I have some tentative answers on some aspects of some questions. I don't think I'm still in a position to say I conclusively know everything. But this much I know for a fact, that a significant amount of history that is being pushed down our throats through certain guardians and through certain echo chambers is largely a function of dominance of a particular ideology, and may not have, dare I say in some aspects, has no basis whatsoever in facts of history. That is something that I tried to address. So one aspect of the first book covers the question of caste, the question of pride, the question of language, the question of the relationship between pre-colonial societies and nature, and how colonization effectively changed that entire relationship by introducing certain definitions of development, by introducing certain notions of how nature is to be seen by humankind, so on and so forth. The second aspect that the first book touches upon are these notions of modernity, rationality, liberalism, so on and so forth, and whether they have secular connotations or secularized connotations despite having Christian origins. That's a very specific question that I've asked. The third aspect which I touched upon in the first book briefly is the aspect of Middle Eastern coloniality, because the first book predominantly discusses European colonization, but since we are not Latin America, which was fortunate enough to be staved or let's say protected from Middle Eastern coloniality, so to speak, or Islamic or Mughal invasion, so to speak, as Bharat, since we have seen 2 different waves of colonization and expansion, it didn't make sense to not touch upon the other aspect. And therefore, the colonization, so to speak, prior to European colonization also merited a significant degree of discussion, because in the absence of that, two-nation theory cannot be understood in its entirety, and therefore the entire specter of partition cannot be understood in its completion, and therefore the impact of partition on the Constitution can also not be understood. So the second book took the discussion of the first book from the perspective of Middle Eastern coloniality, and I have tried to ask whether this creature called Ganga Jamuni Tehzeeb is mythical or real, whether there is something to be called as the composite syncretic culture of this country, and second, whether two-nation theory is to be attributed to somebody like Savarkar or to the Muslim League, or is Muslim League itself a 3rd generation or 4th generation torchbearer of a particular idea which preceded them by at least 150 to 200 years. These are the hard, politically incorrect, sensitive, delicate, uncomfortable questions that I've tried to touch upon. And that, I think, gives you a fair picture of where I stand with respect to the fault lines that afflict this country. So, the net result of this incomplete exercise at this stage is, whether we like it or not, I think two-nation theory as a reality needs to be dealt with. And I don't think the creation of Pakistan put an end to the two-nation theory. Perhaps the two-nation theory is no more pushed as two-nation theory, but it has acquired new avatars. And I have specifically said this in the book, that perhaps it has taken the form of a much more secular, politically incorrect, sanitized version called the majority-minority debate. And the good part of the literature that I've dealt with specifically shows that the opposition to the introduction of Western-style democracy in Bharat primarily came from the Muslim League because they felt that Hindus would outnumber them 4-1 and therefore they would have absolutely no representation in an independent parliamentary-style democratic Bharat. And that triggered the discussion for separate electorates, which gradually crystallized and avalanched to the discussion for a separate homeland altogether, with green, white, and a crescent as its flag. So, I think the discussion around the subject is it has three different verticals. One is whether the aspect of internal colonization that is constantly discussed, which is within the Sanatana Dharma, so to speak, does it have any basis? Second, what are the impacts of external colonization, which has two limbs, the Christian European limb and the Middle Eastern Islamic limb. These are the issues that I've addressed. Now that effectively sets the tone for what I've said so far, what I've written so far. Beyond this, I don't wish to take away your time in terms of coming after me for questions. So shoot, go ahead, I'm ready. Yes. It's 6, I think we have until 7 at least. 7:15, 7:20? Good, okay. No, I prefer standing. I can't sit and talk. The occupation hazard of being a lawyer. Sorry? Yeah. Just 2 requests. Please introduce yourself, your school, so that I understand what background you come from. I would only request you to keep the questions crisp and short in the interest of giving as many people an opportunity. Yes.
Good evening, sir. My name is Janbabgar and I'm a 4th year law student from Guru Gobind Singh University. My question is, how do we explain the fault lines like Sati, Pratha, the caste system and Gungat in Hindu culture that they have converted in the horrendous form that they were practiced in the history, that they have become a tool in the hands of particular people to spew venom on Sanatana Dharma? How do we explain that current form that they existed?
You're from Guru Gobind Singh University. Which stream, please?
Sir, BBLLB.
PBL. Okay. Good. I'm just trying to understand what is the source or the basis of a particular opinion so that I'm in a better position to respond. Please go ahead.
So there's a book called Sonali Bansal where Raja Ram Mohan Roy has been vehemently opposing the burning of women on the pyre of their husband.
Right.
And yeah, that's primarily the source I am informed in which the sati has been practiced. Similarly, on the debate of hijab,
Right.
they also said that in Hinduism maybe there is Gungat.
Right.
On the caste system, we discriminate against our own people.
Right.
So how do we explain all that? How these things turned into a weapon? How these things, their present form? That's my question, sir.
Okay. So the good part of at least sati is there is enough literature from the opposite point of view, not denying the existence or occurrence of sati. So let's not deny its existence or occurrence. I think the question is more about the scale and the demonization of a particular society, citing this as the instance. So one of the things that I happened to touch upon during the course of the writing of the first book is two specific episodes or cultural events in Bharat were used significantly to generate contributions from England for missionary activity in this country. One is the Jagannath Rath Yatra, and the second is Sati. There's a missionary who goes by the name Claudius Buchanan, who features significantly in the discussions surrounding the need for more establishment support for missionary activity in this country. And that discussion happens around the 1919 Government of India Act. So let me give you just a short backdrop, and then I'll come to the question state. Prior to 1858, the reins of power are primarily in the hands of the company, right? Until 1858, there's a gradual shift where the Crown, the Parliament of Britain, both not being the same obviously, and the evangelical groups of UK, that means England, Scotland and Ireland, who had a problem with the fact that the company and a corporate entity was in charge of such a large piece of real estate. And from being merely a commercial mercantile entity, it had morphed into a political entity because it had its own armies. And the snowballing of the rebellion, so to speak, into a situation which effectively loosened, or at least threatened to loosen, the grip of the English onto this particular land, was seen primarily as a mistake of the company and its corporate greed. Until then, while missionary activity started from the early mid-1600s, yes, mid-1600s. In fact, because one of the earliest resolutions that was passed by the directors of the East India Company, English East India Company, was that they would bring the message of the gospel to this country. That is one of their official resolutions, and this was in the 17th century. That much is said with support. But since they were primarily interested in business, they did not want to ruffle too many feathers, and therefore missionary activity would come in trickles, primarily for two things. One, the English establishment here had to be protected from heathen contamination, and their own Christian needs had to be met because they had come with their families. So schools had to be established, chapels had to be established, so on and so forth. So that was the first wave. But this trickle gradually increased in size and scale and in terms of its reach. And by the time it came to 1857, the missionaries sensed a fantastic opportunity to take away the reins of power from the company, so that the crown, which was effectively seen as the protector of Christendom, insofar as UK is concerned, is given greater responsibility and greater say over the affairs of Bharat, or the British territories in India. If you read the literature around this period and the pamphlets that were circulated by missionaries in their country as well as within their own societies in this country, they decided to latch on to two specific cultural events. One is negative and the other is positive, but both were projected in negative light to get missionary contributions or financial contributions. The word juggernaut, which effectively comes from the Jagannath Yatra, which is common knowledge, was coined by Claudius Buchanan. And he said that this is such a dark religion that during this Rath Yatra, people throw themselves under the wheel and die. And therefore, these people need to be saved from their own religion. That started the never-ending project of reforming the Hindu faith. Along with this, Sati was also projected. Now, Ms. Meenakshi Jain, or Dr. Meenakshi Jain, in her book on Sati, tries to address the question from an empirical perspective to say, how many parts of this country and in how many instances can you actually cite of Sati happening at such a rampant scale for it to come to represent this particular culture. Now, the demonization of Sanatana Dharma and the Hindu society citing Sati, if you want an indication of it, I will give you an international instrument which I have cited in the book, wherein of all the abhorrent practices which inflict injury upon human dignity, guess which practice was cited as one of them? Sati. So the only thing that you seem to think or you can conceive of when it comes to the society are untouchability, sati, dowry, and Jagannath Yatra. Now that answers one part of the question. Now, do I agree with sati? No, I don't. I am saying that you have chosen a handful of instances to paint an entire society. We are being told that generalization of any particular community citing the conduct of a particular handful amounts to stereotyping. I am asking, is it fair for you to do this with us? That's one. Second, as far as Parda is concerned, should it continue today? Assuming that circumstances have not changed between medieval Bharat and today, I would say it has no reason to change. But unfortunately, I don't think the situation has changed across the country. I am saying that the medieval mindset continues to exist in certain parts of the country. I am making that statement. And therefore, in those instances, when people do something to protect themselves, I would say I'm in no position to judge them and their circumstances. In the princely state of Hyderabad, the supposed richest princely state and perhaps the largest, the ruler's entourage would willy-nilly pick up women from other communities. I should know this, I come from that state. We have experienced it. At least our previous generations have experienced it. The non-majority population or the non-ruling population, although the majority population, was treated as a hostage population. And you should ask yourself how that population was used to negotiate with the Indian Union around the period of Operation Polo. Correct. In light of this, it's convenient to start with the presumption that this is a fundamentally backward society without giving it some slack and cutting it some slack in terms of the brutal, ruthless, savage experience that it has been put through, at the very least since the 10th century or the 11th century. And which is I would say, which has gone on and on and on. It's one thing to ask whether some of these practices merit existence today. But it's another thing to question, why did they start in the first place? I mean, people were not idiots to jump into the fire, right? Something must have triggered it. So I would say, perhaps avoid the lazy presumption and conclusion that this is a feature of an inherently regressive society, and do more justice to your own intelligence by reading a bit more on the subject. And I don't mean you, this is not a personal comment. I'm saying in general, so please don't take it personally. So I believe that a lot of things that we are fed and which we spew hasn't been examined with the rigor that it merits. And maybe, perhaps, I'm contributing my limited might to it in terms of unpacking those presumptions. Next. Yes, please. Yes, next person. Yes.
Good evening, sir.
Who is it? Yes, please. Ji.
Sir, my name is Rajratan and I am from JNU MA Ancient History first year. Sir, my question is, does the nationalism or it should be termed as the ultra-nationalism, does it expose our fault lines to our adversaries which they exploit? Or what should be the way forward for a nation like us, whether it should be the nationalism or patriotism? Because we have a very good example of our one neighbor, that what can jingoism do with a nation. We have a very good example in our neighbor. So what should be the way forward for us?
Do me a favor, and perhaps for the benefit of the audience, can you perhaps distinguish between nationalism and patriotism?
Nationalism is, I am the best.
Please don't give me Dr. Tharu's definition. I don't agree with him.
No, sir.
He basically said a patriot is someone who can die for the country, and a nationalist is someone who can kill for the country. Then what do you make of the soldiers, man? What argument is that? Forget it. Give me a better
nationalism
argument.
is like, I am the best and
Right.
nobody can beat my level.
Right.
Like everybody is lower than my level.
Right.
And patriotism is, I have some level and anyone can achieve that level. That is the patriotism.
Okay, fine. What do you think of Indian nationalism? Does it have a religious bias to it or not?
Sir,
What is your
currently
most
it
message?
seems like some events in recent past that it seems like it does have a religious biasness.
Okay.
Few events like which exposes our fault lines to the adversaries that they exploit
Okay.
at global level also.
Okay. Around the 1900s, when the talk of nationalism started, was it irreligious nationalism according to you?
No, it was a religious nationalism.
How? Spell it out. Which religions are we talking about?
Like Christianity.
Around the 1900s in this country, there were two parallel streams of nationalism. One was Hindu clearly, and the other was Muslim clearly. Okay? Now we are being told that either you give up the concept of nationalism altogether and restrict yourself to patriotism, or you subscribe to civic nationalism as opposed to religious nationalism. These are the two arguments. And when we ask what is the meaning of civic nationalism, we are being told you subscribe to the constitution, and that would amount to civic nationalism. Okay? Which is to say, if you pledge allegiance to this document, you are a nationalist. And that is the civic nationalism that Dr. Tharoor effectively pushes on a regular basis. Now, in the context of Bharat, I don't think it's possible to subscribe to an irreligious form of nationalism, given that religion continues to feature heavily in our political discussions, and it is not a new divide, it's a pre-existing divide that dates back to at least 700 to 800 years at the very least, and which has seen vivisection of the country and continued balkanization of certain parts of the country, which Article 370 was meant to stem to some extent. Or rather, the amendment to Article 370 was meant to stem to some extent. I am unable to subscribe to the view that given the current state of affairs, it's possible to subscribe to a liberal form of nationalism. Because as someone who speaks of dharmic civilizationism, there is a very clear resistive component in my attitude. Not a reactionary or a reactive component, but a resistive component. Which is to say that the continued attempt to pixelate my identity as a Hindu through balkanization of their identity in the form of language, in the form of caste, or in the form of racial studies, is something that I wish to resist. And therefore, as someone who understands the Eurocentric origins of nationalism, I will reject the imposition of European-style nationalism on this country, but I will certainly subscribe to a very clear resistive civilizationalism in the interest of my Sanskriti. And that is something that I will certainly stand for. And there is a reason for it. European nationalism has a supremacist component. It also has a serious anthropocentric component where race features heavily, complexion features heavily, and the projection of European-style nationalism onto the struggles of the, let's say, of this society, which has seen two waves of colonization, is to impose white guilt onto non-whites. And that is something that I think is historically inaccurate and, dare I say, positively dumb. So that's one of the reasons that I refuse to buy the imported labels of left and right, because both of them have their own European origins. And therefore, perhaps I'm asking for some semblance of originality in crafting your position based on indigenous ethos as opposed to Western ethos. So to answer your question, recraft nationalism to civilizationalism predominantly, be conscious of the history of the last at least 150 years and the last 75 years. And remember that partition is not an act of the past or in the past. It seems to be an ongoing activity at several levels by two different set of state and non-state actors. So whether it gives others to divide, let's say a handle to divide us, It means that in the absence of the outsider, we are otherwise united, which I think is a major presumption. We are not otherwise united. What am I basically saying? When someone says the partition is the product of the divide and rule policy of the British man, oh, that evil British man, of course he was evil, but he was exploiting a pre-existing divide, he was not creating a divide. That is the distinction between the position of a certain cross-section of people and my position. Literature tells me that the divide was real, the divide was very vicious, and the divide continued to show in the form of multiple riots, almost on an annual basis, on the same set of issues. And this recurring wound clearly seems to be the remnant of a continuing schism or battle. In light of that, people previously have struggled to come out with some kind of a neutral identity and they've failed. That neutral identity led to the bloody partition of the sacred geography called Bharat, with massive loss of lives. If that experiment has not succeeded, assuming it were to be undertaken by a better set of people who are supremely qualified, who are more honest, who have greater integrity, why would I assume that the very same experiment will succeed in the hands of lesser mortals? So I don't see the point in being neutral. I am not neutral. I clearly have a very defined position. I'd rather be honest about that position and support that position than put on the facade of neutrality like several journalists do. We don't live in the age of neutrality. We might as well wake up and smell the coffee. Yes. There's this gentleman who's been waiting for a while. So then and the yellow jacket behind after that. We'll come to that. I'll come to you after that. Please.
Thank you, sir, for your enlightening speech. Sir, my question has two dimensions. Basically, I'll be asking on language.
Ji.
So, just I want to give a very brief background of my question. Sir, language represent a structure of power. A structure.
Not to stop you, अगर आप चाहें तो आप हिंदी में बात कर सकते हैं. It's up to you, entirely up to you.
ठीक है सर.
What is the point of constantly talking of decoloniality otherwise? Go ahead.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
सर, लैंग्वेज मतलब एक पावर स्ट्रक्चर को रिप्रेजेंट कर सकता है या फिर पावर स्ट्रक्चर बना सकते हैं
जी.
और दूसरा बात ये है कि लैंग्वेज ऑफ ए गिवन कल्चर enormously I mean shape how a people think of things like their perception on family, on society, on state, or other things. So coming to your point, like manufacture fault-line of Bharat, we have talked like the minority-majority debate represent the new avatar of two-nation theory. But I would say we have multiple nation theory based on language-based assertion, like we have in Northeast, we have in South or other part of the country.
Right.
So how to address this like language-based fault line in spite of having an underlying unity of all Indian languages? Second question is, sir, when we talk about decolonization, sir, particularly in judicial space, the official, the prevalent language is English. When we say like decolonization in judicial space, how we can assert that without representation of Indian languages, we can ensure decolonization in judicial space?
Fair enough. So, on the basis of the limited reading that I've done so far, I blame two specific milestones in Bharatiya history for entrenching language-based chauvinism and regionalism. The partition of Bengal had both a religious component as well as a linguistic component of 1905. That needs to be understood in greater detail, and how that particular language-based division gradually translated to several provinces and British territories being carved out on the basis of language, then finally culminating in independent Bharat taking the very same policy forward in the form of the States Reorganization Act of 1956, where you started creating state-based languages, okay, or language-based states rather. there was, I think, one suggestion that was given by Rajagopalachari then, which is that you might as well divide the country into 8 or 9 administrative units, with each of them having at least more than one language as their official language, thereby ensuring that there is greater language representation at the state level. What is everybody looking for? Let's be clear about it. What are we saying? It's one thing for us to use a particular language in the course of our societal interactions, but it does not get the same sense of respect or mainstreaming until it becomes the state language for the purposes of state communication, right? And therefore, at the very least, assuming that language-based states are an existing reality and they are the reality for the foreseeable future, why don't we think of more than one official language for each state at the very least? Wherein you have one perhaps dominant language, and maybe the second language alternates every few years, depending on the number of minorities in that particular state. But the question will be, how economically feasible is this? What does it translate to in the form of burden on the state when it comes to doing this? If you think of yourself as a civilizational state, this is a must, no matter what the cost. But if you want to nationalize a civilization, you will succeed in reducing economic burden, but you will increase your societal fissures. And every few years you will have this issue coming up in the form of legitimate representation for visibility at the state level. That's one of the reasons that I think it makes a lot more sense to see Bharat as a smaller version of Europe in terms of languages. The difference being that there is greater civilizational and dharmic unity within Bharat, but that linguistic diversity needs to be respected at a greater level. Unless and until you do that, to answer the question of the previous gentleman who asked the question of, aren't we giving more handles to the other? I am saying you're handing more weapons to the other side, which is interested in using these identities to create further fissures. So wherever it's possible, not to appease, but to legitimately address a certain concern, do it. You ask a few people coming from the Northeast, they'll clearly say, I'm sorry, Bengali is not our script. What is happening to our scripts? How is that a wrong question to ask? If you don't do that, mischievous elements are bound to be given weapons from outside the country, and legitimate sentiments will become secessionist sentiments. Stop it from happening as soon as possible. So I would say Bharat needs to become more linguistically diverse in terms of its business transactions, in terms of its state transactions, how much ever is possible. So, okay, let's look at it this way. If the union were to issue a particular document which perhaps is meant for a particular state, at the very least follow the 3-language policy in giving that particular document. English for wider consumption, unfortunately, Hindi for whatever reason, and at the very least that state's language. Will that not shut up the Dravidianists? They obviously have only these kind of issues to constantly cry and whine about. Take it away from them. As someone who comes from the glorious land of Tamil Nadu, I think Dravidianism is a cancer. And it single-handedly has created an artificial divide with a lot of support from external actors. It needs to be addressed. It can be addressed provided nobody else is interested in imposing their language chauvinism on others. I have no hatred of any Bharatiya language. Underline Bharatiya. That's the operative word. Which means nobody can at least accuse me of having a particular hatred or ghrana for Hindi. I switch to Hindi as quickly as possible whenever I speak in public, and as often as possible. So I can't be accused of someone who has a problem with the language. If you're interested in keeping the union together, particularly given the history of several mischievous non-state external actors, you have to build bridges which are two-way streets, not a one-way street. Second, what can be done before the judiciary? $1 million question. As someone who's a stakeholder in that particular system, I will do my best to steer clear of the Contempt of Courts Act and make my submissions in as diplomatic a fashion as possible, going against the grain of my own nature. Okay. पहले हिंदी को तो सुप्रीम कोर्ट में जगह मिले, उसके बाद बाकियों का देखेंगे. You guys are not able to impose yourself on the Supreme Court. Where do we stand? So, I think an interesting suggestion came from one person who makes it a point to speak of indigenization of our content and education. Namely that when the International Court of Justice or European judicial systems can at the very least operate with multiple languages, why can't a country that constantly boasts of its linguistic diversity do the very same thing when it comes to its judiciary? Surely you don't expect a judge of the Supreme Court to know more than one language. I'm asking myself, why doesn't it occur to us to create a system of interpreters, which is possible in United Nations, which is possible in the European Parliament, which is possible in the European Court of Justice? Why can't it be possible in this country, which is a subcontinent that masquerades as a country? It's surprising that you choose to highlight your diversity when you have to speak the greatness of your country, but when it comes to the application of that particular concept on a very real level, somehow the diversity seems to take a backseat. Imagine the number of mischievous arguments you can take away from a lot of anti-nationals. Oh, I've dropped the word. What to do? Go ahead. Next. Yes. I'll just add water if possible. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, next.
Hello, sir.
He's been waiting for quite some time. The gentleman who's just raised his hand. Please. Yeah, please. Go ahead. Multiple jackets here. Next. Let him finish. Yeah.
I'm Sandeep Kumar, a PhD student in Ancient History, Center for Historical Studies, JNU. So my question is, on secularism, Yuval Noah Harari in his book 21 Lessons for 21st Century dedicated one section on secularism in his book, where he tries to redefine. So Yuval Noah Harari in his book 21 Lessons for 21st Century dedicated a section on secularism, where he tries to redefine secularism for 21st century. In short, for him, secularism means questioning and rationality. According to you, do we really need to redefine secularism for 21st century or completely discard it in Indian context? Thank you.
Okay. So anybody who knows my positions, which option do you think I stand for? Discarding secularism. Redefining secularism means, in principle, accepting the validity of a Western concept for Bharatiya civilization without asking why. Or trying to find, oh no, hum bhi secular hai. Come on, let's pull out some justifications from the Vedas and Upanishads for this. That is retrofitting a Western concept to somehow assuage your own inferiority complex. To say that I am equally Western, but from an Indian sense. How stupid is that argument? What is the problem in asking, why is secularism a valid principle for this country? Now, the only question that you should be asking is, does it translate to exclusion of certain groups and identities? Or is there a better way to accommodate it? Given the weaponization of this particular concept, I am unable to buy the notion that Indian style secularism is even remotely comparable to European style secularism. It is a uniquely Indian jantu, which conveniently looks at France when it needs to, which conveniently looks at UK when it needs to, which conveniently looks at United States when it needs to. This is an Avkashwadi of the first order, who doesn't have a core nature to define. That's precisely why in the Constituent Assembly debates it was said that this word and this concept is capable of so many definitions and mischievous definitions that let's not use it. It was kept outside the pale of the express language of the Constitution precisely for this reason. They discuss several versions and then they say drop this word. It has multiple meanings. The only provision where secular as a word was present, even before its introduction in 1976, was in 25.2a or 25.2b, where it speaks of secular aspects of a religious institution. In that sense, it simply distinguishes religious aspects of a religious institution from secular aspects of the religious institution, which is management, finances, so on and so forth. That's not the same as secularism. It's not an ism in that particular sense. It's not a concept in that particular sense. I refuse to buy the fact that the experience of the last 75 years of this country is not a case study in the kind of mischief that one particular word is capable of being, let's say, pushed into service for. Secularism is perhaps the biggest mischief. The question should always be, okay, if not this, what next? Does it translate to HR? Not human rights, you know what I mean, right? Then what does it translate to for everybody else? If somebody has a question about what is HR, in the context of secularism coming from me, I'm sure what I mean. Next, so, frankly speaking, maybe we should have a really honest conversation on the origins of this particular concept. You know why we aspire for some of these concepts? At least in perhaps in a very intuitive sense. We are constantly being told that the way to achieve Western progress is to accept all principles that the West has accepted as the guiding posts for material success. And therefore, the first thing you must do is secularism, rationality, modernity. And that argument has been pushed and pushed and pushed. Surprisingly, African countries have come up with fantastic responses to this bloody notion than India, which prides itself in terms of its legal scholarship and, let's say, cultural scholarship and whatnot. So I would certainly say, one of the things that perhaps I'm pushing through the argument of decoloniality, if you have a problem with it, forget it. Let's call it originality, indigeneity. You have a problem with decoloniality, forget it. Is, at the very least, apply original principles. Have the confidence to draw from the values of your own society. You can certainly ask, do our values have contemporary relevance? That's a very legitimate question to ask. Go ahead, ask it. No problem. But I would certainly refuse to buy lock, stock and barrel everything that comes from the West. Because they go through their own process of trial and error, and we seem to be following them in their process of trial and error as if the rest of us have absolutely no brains whatsoever. That is something that I cannot buy. Next. He's been waiting. The striped shirt. I'll come to you next. 100% I'll come to you next. Go ahead. You, striped shirt. You've been asking, right? You've been waiting for it. Yeah, go ahead, please.
हेलो नमस्ते सर।
नमस्ते
सर, मेरा नाम अर्पित है और मैं यहाँ फिजिक्स में पीएचडी कर रहा हूँ। तो सर, मेरा क्वेश्चन ये है कि क्या हमारे देश की जो डाइवर्सिटी ही है, क्या वही हमारी प्रॉब्लम, जो हमारी और जो डाइवर्सिटी है वही एक तरीके से हथियार बनते जा रहे हैं जो एंटी नेशनल फोर्सेस हैं उनके लिए? और अगर ऐसा है तो हम इस चीज़ से फाइट कैसे कर सकते हैं? और एक और चीज़ सर, जैसा कि मैं समझ पाया हूँ कि डॉक्टर मीनाक्षी जैन ने अपनी बुक में लिखा है कि जो सती प्रथा थी मोस्टली राजस्थान के रीजन में फॉलो होती थी, बट उसको अंग्रेजों ने बैन किया था बंगाल रीजन में। और उसके बैन होने के बाद जो केसेस वहां पर आए थे, बहुत 6 या 7 केसेस थे जो उन्होंने कुछ एक पीरियड ऑफ टाइम में बोला था। तो ऐसा हुआ है कि होते किसी और रीजन में कुछ प्रैक्टिस होती थी और उसके नाम पर हमारे पूरे देश को और पूरे धर्म को जो है वो लोग उसका दता बता देते थे।
जी।
तो इस चीज को लेकर के क्या करना चाहिए कि कुछ प्रैक्टिसेस रीजनल हैं और उसके नाम पर हमें सब लोगों को टारगेट कर लिया जाता है, और जो हमारी डाइवर्सिटी है क्या उसको हथियार भी बनाया जा सकता है उन लोगों से फाइट करने के लिए?
Right.
Thank you so much.
So on the issue of Sati, interestingly in her book, Dr. Jain also points out how the Thakur family, which is Rabindranath Tagore and all these people, basically stood up and said, you want to go after a certain practice, that's one thing, but you have used this practice to define my entire culture, my journey as a civilization. They said, you can address the problem without going after the entire community and our way of life. This came from what I would call the patron saint of liberalism, Rabindranath Tagore, clearly is making this statement. That family took a leading position in this to fight against this entire stereotyping of the community. We seem to be citing Rabindranath Tagore for all sorts of reasons which are peaceful and whatnot. But the very clear, unapologetic strain of nationalism that he represented also needs to be spoken about around that period. The valorization of Raja Ram Mohan Roy needs to be re-examined very seriously. And his impact in single-handedly destroying the self-esteem of the Hindu community has to be examined. Based on his own correspondence with the British establishment, multiple letters. Now, coming to your question of whether diversity itself is an inherent weakness. Okay, what is the alternative? Submerge all local identities and create this Hindu unity? It won't happen. And it shouldn't happen. It cannot happen. Everybody is attached to their most proximal identities. The hope is that you give an underlying stream of commonality which also manages to keep this alive and connects people. Unfortunately, the investment post the advent of the European colonization is to kill common bonds and to highlight diversity in the form of language, in the form of religion, which is to say, balkanize the Hindu identity so much that every form of practice is seen as a local form of practice which has nothing to do with the neighboring state or neighboring region. You want an example? I'll give you an example. The number of people who reacted to Kantara based on that particular experience, which reminded them of their own local experiences, is astounding. Himachalis, Punjab, for God's sakes, so many places, they reacted to this. So that tells me, killing diversity isn't the solution. Strengthening common aspects is perhaps the possible way forward. And which also means language as a battleground needs to be addressed. And that takes us to Sanskrit. Well, I'm going to be accused of quite a few fantastic labels when I bring up Sanskrit. So be it, I don't care. The point is, we have had a lingua franca and we have also had our own Desha Bhasha. So there's a very clear distinction between Deva Bhasha and Desha Bhasha, both feeding each other. And Desha Bhashas have never been found to suffocate or die because of any specific impetus given to Deva Bhasha. Otherwise, how do you explain this rich culture in so many languages? Bengali, Marathi, Tamil, Telugu, Kannada, whatnot. If anything, each of them has enriched or has been enriched thanks to the common reservoir it is capable of drawing from. If language is seen as a verbal manifestation of a civilization's journey, there is a common pool that all of us get to draw from and localize. No wonder there are two epics that have multiple local representations. Examples going with it, anecdotes going with it, idioms and muhavras going along with it. So, I'm not even for one bit the stifling or destruction of sub-identities. Because if the replacement is not as strong and credible enough, it will only create a vacuum. And that vacuum is precisely what quite a few people are waiting for. So that they can swoop in and save your soul. Next. Good evening.
My name is Dyuti. I'm from Jammu. I did my law from Pune. Because I'm from the region, my question is related to that region itself. There are various creatures, so to speak, in your language, who subscribe to the idea of Azadi. And how do we tackle this, first of all? How do we tell them, or how do we just, get them back to the notion of civilizational identity that they seem to miss out on? Second question would be, do you think the current sedition law requires a reframement? And thirdly, I would like to talk about, ask you about the current immigration system. I mean, illegal immigrants that are everywhere. Specifically in Jammu, recently we had a judgment there about Mohammed Salimullah and another versus Union of India.
Yeah, writ petition 715.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, owing to that, we had about 650 illegal immigrants shipped out. And there are
That's
still
nothing.
currently
The number is nothing.
many more. There are over
Correct.
6,000 illegal immigrants still sitting in Jammu and changing the entire demographic system there.
Right.
So how do we tackle that? That's my third question.
Okay, so this question will open the floodgates. How many people want me to answer this question? Show of hands, please. Okay, fine. The consequences and repercussions are for you to bear. That's it. Okay. Coming to the question of the Azadi Brigade. Any attempt on your part to negotiate has been and will be interpreted as a sign of weakness and lack of spine on your part. Some people have convinced themselves so much of the righteousness and the sanctity of their cause, and I mean the divine nature of their cause, that you cannot hope to reach out to them through reason. And if that belief also comes in the way of the existence of civilizational identities, I don't think it makes sense to hope that peace will do the trick, or even economics for that matter will do the trick. Economics as a carrot can be offered, but the stick must be wielded as often and as clearly as possible without an iota of guilt or compunction. So during the course of a preparation for a lecture on Hindu justice systems, I went through the translations of William Jones and other people on what they thought of our justice delivery system, because the much reviled Manu is seen as one of the foremost lawmakers. And there are, let's say, perhaps plaques and quotes dedicated to him in what we constantly look up to, London. Okay? Not that it makes a difference to me. I'd prefer that there are plaques and quotes for him in Bharat, not in London. Now, coming to the question of what he said, Hindus as a community are mild in disposition, but that is in stark contrast to the emphasis on punishment in its criminal justice system. The importance and deterrent value of punishment is underscored heavily in our justice delivery systems. And therefore, there are two ways of addressing this. Let's hope that the first way and the most preferred way is the constitutional and the legal way. The state needs to take a very clear position that this nonsense will not be tolerated under any circumstances, even in an educational campus, the moment you're over the age of 18. Doesn't matter. Bacche hai, students hai, does not make a difference, will not be tolerated. It cannot and should not be tolerated under any circumstances. Anyone who resorts to that kind of secessionism must be ostracized in their own immediate vicinity. And that is the societal response. The state will do its job of bringing the hammer down on the bloody head. That's a different issue, but the society must also respond. Because it's not just about the state and the integrity of the statist infrastructure, it is as much about your survival as a society. So the society must take a position. So the society has been a passive whining stakeholder in this entire equation. हम क्या करें? करने के बहुत सारी चीजें, तरीके हैं, lawfully, legally, constitutionally, peacefully. But the message must be sent. This is not acceptable. You can only ask for anything which has as its precondition that you will remain a part of this country. Anything else that leads remotely in the direction of secession is off the table and is non-negotiable. That's it. That's one. Two, illegal migration, specifically in Jammu, is not a matter of coincidence. It's not a matter of happenstance. According to me, it's a very clear, calculated design. Does it seem like a conspiracy theory? Okay. What are people from the Uyghur province doing in Kashmir and Jammu? Why have they been given special cards? Kashmiri Pandits and Hindus don't seem to get the very same treatment that people from China get. The manner in which the right to, let's say, restoration of citizenship under the previously evil Article 35A needs to be questioned. And somehow people find the way to come all the way from Arakan, Myanmar to Jammu. वो दिल्ली में भी है, छोड़ दो. मैं ये कह रहा हूं that from here to there ये क्या रास्ता है भाई? And आपका मार्ग कौन प्रशस्त कर रहा है? बीच में कितने लोग बैठे हैं आपके लिए डॉक्यूमेंट्स तैयार करने के लिए? Read the report of Lieutenant General Sinha in the context of illegal migration in Assam. 85 to 98. How many groups were set up to create documents? Are you surprised at the results of the NRC of Assam? I am not. Not one bit. सारी तैयारी हो चुकी है, जो करना है कर लो, कागज तो निकल जाएंगे, इस पे तो कागज निकल जाएंगे. So, you see, the problem is people really don't know the extent of illegal migration, and even the government is giving very conservative figures. If you look at the figures that were given in 1998 in that report, and that report, while it was meant for Assam, spoke of Delhi, spoke of Maharashtra, spoke of Mumbai and so many places, वो 98 की बात है. 2008, 2018 and 2022. It has only gotten better. You go to this remote part of Tamil Nadu called Kadalur. Please go and find out if there are people from the Rohingya origin there or not. Please go to Goa. Please go to Chembur. So, we are being told even this is something that we don't have the right to raise. Someone comes to this country for livelihood or because they are being persecuted, even then I would say we should be fairly careful given the hostile neighborhood that we live in. This is not the United States of America, which is bounded by the Pacific Ocean and Atlantic Ocean. We live next to China, Bangladesh and Pakistan. You need to be very, very careful. So, I think the first step is to be clear about who you think is the insider and who you think is the outsider insofar as this discussion is concerned. The stupidity is proponents and supporters of illegal migration in this country take the very same position of Hollywood because they're saying immigration brings in diversity. अरे immigration और illegal migration के बीच का अंतर नहीं समझ में आता है तुमको? What is there between your ears? Is it a blessed hollow? Why should illegal migration receive any kind of protection? Illegal migration can translate to the status of refugee provided there are circumstances which result in creation of refugees. What circumstances in Bangladesh translate to creation of refugee status here? If at all it has to be the refugee status, it has to be the minority population whose numbers are dwindling there. So, I think on illegal migration, we need a very clear separate law commission or a separate study which undertakes a census exclusively of illegal migrants. It needs to come out. People from outside of Kashmir cannot go to Kashmir because it apparently changes the inherent indigenous demographics of Kashmir. But that argument is inapplicable to Bharat as a whole. Very surprising and selective. Why should that be even remotely acceptable? So, in 2017, much before these issues came about, and we were among the first interveners in this Muhammad Salimullah case, I think a portal ran a piece on how this is a xenophobic position, this is an Islamophobic position, this and that and everything else. They kept peppering that entire article with labels, but not a single credible logical counter. Give me a legal counter to what I have said. Which principle of international law under which instrument requires me to put and let's say subject my own country to this kind of silent invasion? Please tell me that. Which statute do you want to resort to? What doctrine of non-refoulement actually permits and supports this? I really don't understand. The first exception to the principle of non-refoulement is national security, domestic security. You get to carve out an exception saying, I'm sorry, I am not going to open myself up to a crucible under any circumstances. Bangladesh can seem to take the position with respect to Rohingyas, but in India is not afforded the very same position. Next. Yes. Let him finish.
Namaste sir.
Namaste.
My name is Saksham Singh and I'm a second year law student at Law Center 2, Faculty of Law. So sir, I'm currently reading your first book, and there you have talked about obliteration of these particular colonial constructs, right, like right and left, and these are volatile terms, right? So my question is, there you have also offered a solution at the end, and that is like one solution is that altogether replacement of these terms on indie basis, right? And the second solution was that let these terms stay, but their definitions have to be on indie terms, right? So my question right now is that there are manufactured fault lines and there are pre-existing fault lines.
Right.
So identification and fixation of both these fault lines, does this process have to be before these two solutions, before either of these two solutions which have been offered by you, or this process may even be offered after such thing, or after such identification and fixation.
Right.
So does this process have to be before or after? And
I get your question.
And just one
Please,
last thing,
go
sir. That is that whether this process takes place before or after. My submission or my final thing, what I want to say is that what would be an ideal situation where we would be as a civilization free of all the influence around us in both of these situations.
I'll answer the second question first because quite a few people have misunderstood that part of the book. Maybe I'll take the blame for it for not being as clear. If you look at the conclusion of the first section of the book, किसी के पास पहला पुस्तक है? Just open the conclusion to the first section and just give it to me for a moment. Let me just read it out. By the way, the solution that you say I've offered is actually not my solution. I have cited another author for it.
Yes. Sorry.
So allow me to just read out this portion from the end of the first section. This is on pages 144 and 145. Most people from the science stream may not get the true import of this because of their lack of exposure to humanities. But I'm assuming that we are predominantly in a room of people who have come from the humanities background, and I'm 100% sure you guys will relate to it better. From the discussion undertaken in this section, a few questions may arise. For instance, how practical is the decolonial option? After all, if coloniality is omnipresent by design and has resulted in a globalized and heavily integrated world that places the West, within brackets the global North, at the top and the rest at the bottom as the global South, how does decoloniality hope to upset the established global order? Here I'm drawing from the Joker's lines, okay, from the Dark Knight. So what is decoloniality's vision of the future, assuming it has the wherewithal to achieve its goals? So after asking these questions, here's what I'm saying. First, in order to answer these questions, it may help to understand that 500 years is nothing from the standpoint of human history. and therefore there is no reason to assume that the history of the last 5 centuries shall remain the history even for the next 100 years. After all, the West is not what it was even half a century ago. Second, while different commentators and authorities on the subject of decoloniality may have differing views, from what I've understood, it seems to me that the goal is to regain the space for indigenities to breathe, which allows them to compete in the supposedly free market of ideas by letting them tell their own stories in their own languages. Some believe the world has changed forever by virtue of European colonialism, and there is no going back to pre-colonial ways of life, which makes indigenous societies eternal or perpetual victims. However, ever since the offshoots of coloniality, namely globalization and unconscientious mercantilism, have begun to expose the utterly destructive impact of coloniality on nature, placing the world in a crisis, the cautious hope is that the world will begin its quest for alternatives that respect nature as being central to civilization, as opposed to relegating it to the category of a mere resource. This endeavor could possibly bring the world to the doorstep of indigenous knowledge systems, which could in turn lead to the resurgence of relational association with nature, which is perhaps the intended outcome of decoloniality. Now, hold on for this. In other words, it is this window of global introspection on the treatment of nature that is capable of enabling the reinscription of indigenities in their respective spheres of influence, thereby exposing the provincial validity of Europeanism and its false claim of universalism. To be clear, while decoloniality may not result in the extinction of Europeanism, it may certainly limit Europeanism to the borders of its origin, which is Europe, and allow indigenities to re-exist, albeit in a hybrid form. This could have implications for Europeanism even within Europe in the sense that it may introspect and revisit its own pre-Christian past, which could re-establish the centrality of nature in the mothership of Christian dualism. But again, I'm getting ahead of myself. So what am I trying to say here? You see, when you speak of decoloniality, you can't say, let's wipe out the influence of English altogether. Let's wipe out the influence of the West altogether. Agar aap karna bhi chahe, it's not possible. Because you're all connected. What part of your life are you going to be able to give up? I don't think that's the intention here. Because that is going to result in self-imposed isolationism. You will have to be the Japan of the pre-Meiji period, where there is absolutely no interaction with the rest of the world. Or even China for that matter, which said, let's shut all our borders. Not possible. China has not been able to succeed, even with its kind of governance structure, from, let's say, the influence of the rest of the world percolating into China. Even Russia hasn't been able to do it, right? So what are you looking at? You are looking at a hybrid model, which is, if it is 70-30 today, wherein 30% or less is what is the space for ideas which are native or which are indigenous in nature, can we alter that equation a bit? Practically, iska matlab kya hai? In legal education, Hindu legal jurisprudence is relegated only to personal laws. It never features in your education on jurisprudence, on political science, on moral theories, on contractual jurisprudence, on criminal jurisprudence. It's all ornamental. It's like the dress you choose to wear on a festive occasion. That's it. Beyond that, it has no value. You don't have the guts to wear it to your office spaces. Right? The hope is that in education and in other spheres, you improve and increase the indigenous component. And if it has the strength to survive in the contemporary world, then it is for the idea to survive. You can't constantly protect it. If it has the ability to survive, it will. If it does not, unfortunately, it is the survivor of the fittest. There's nothing that you can do about it. But the hope is that these voices which are resistive in nature also get an audience, and let the audience decide what they want. One of the reasons I crafted the paragraph in this particular fashion is, I felt that the world would have drawn a few important lessons after the bloody pandemic, with respect to development, with respect to prosperity, with respect to nature, so on and so forth. And since the Western model of growth is built on destruction of nature, they will have to revisit it, but since they don't have the tools to re-examine, they will have to come to native societies to understand how this works. Which is why, when they speak of climate change, when they speak of handling the climate crisis, their leading researchers are forced to go back to hunter-gatherer communities which still survive, or let's say communities which have managed to keep their ecosystems alive, as to how did they do this? What are we doing wrong? And the moment they do that, they will have to realize that not only do you have to protect their way of life, you will also have to protect their belief system, because they go hand in hand for these communities, which is exactly why the tribal way of life and tribal beliefs are going to be connected. That is the case for most pre-colonial societies. So the hope is that climate change will induce some sense and revisit most notions. Take it from me, if your economic model changes, your cultural model will also change. Next. Because economics and culture don't operate in silos, they influence each other.
Namaste sir, my name is Prince and I am doing my PhD from Center for the Study of Law and Governance, JNU. Sir, my question is related to the economics of the caste system. Today, sir, from past 75 years, we are looking for the solution which are being incorporated in the West, and to eradicate those the caste system, we are imposing it in Indian society. Whereas when we see thousands years back, the caste system, the caste system was there, but most of the communities or the people were fed by the communities itself. Like from a teacher to the master, a teacher to the barber, everyone was being fed by the village or the communities. So how can we incorporate these solutions in combating the caste system in today's time? And sir, I have another question related to the temples law, which we are carrying the colonial baggage right now. The treasury of the temple are still taken up, sometimes taken up by the government.
So, what's your name, please?
Sir Prince.
Thank you so much. So, I don't think it's possible for us to even think of the economics of caste without addressing the politics of caste. And that's a very delicate, thorny issue to address. When one class of people effectively see that as an oppressive structure, which is oppressive by design, you're trying to tell them that there is an economic benefit to this. You'll immediately be told, well, there are economic benefits to slavery also. And therefore the comparison will be directly between slavery and caste system. So, I think the one thing I've said repeatedly over the years is, it is one of the most reviled, poorly understood systems. Having said that, gradually when people realize that the growth-based model or the service-based model, which we currently have employed, has resulted in paucity of quality teachers, has resulted in paucity of, let's say, people who do it with a certain code of honor and not just for the remuneration of it. They may want to reconsider their own notions of what they think of the caste system. Is that system perfect? I am not going to comment on that because of paucity of knowledge on that particular front. I am not going to comment on that beyond it. However, does it deserve the kind of hatred that it gets? I don't think so. And let us be honest, by and large, caste makes its presence felt today primarily in major societal transactions, which effectively boils down to marriage. Beyond that, really, where does it make its presence felt? In urban spaces. Unless you're entrenching it further and further and further through the reservation debate. So I don't see how you can claim to fight caste and also entrench caste through reservation at the same time. Then you're speaking from both sides of your mouth. It's like a Jekyll and Hyde position. It's not. You can't put it together. You can't say the same thing in the same breath. Second, in terms of contemporary relevance of caste, I have come down to this final limited position. In so-called modern secular professions, perhaps caste has no role. Because caste has an entire way of life codified, from dietary restrictions to whatnot, provided you are performing the very same vocation as your previous generation. Which is why there is a clear connection between what you eat and what you do, because you come down to the basics of Hindu philosophy, which is whether it is tamasic or sattvic or rajasic, and accordingly the food is commensurate with the profession that you start, or let's say you undertake. And by and large, since it was hereditary in nature, that used to be the case. So it was a transmission of not just the profession or skill set, it is a transmission of a way of life. That today is now limited to very small enclaves or islands, namely in Veda Patashalas, or in places where somebody is still performing a hereditary profession, such as Goldsmiths are by and large still hereditary. Weavers are still by and large hereditary. Sculptors are by and large hereditary. Exceptions exist, but exceptions only prove the rule, they don't destroy the rule. So, in these professions, whether you like it or not, they will follow the practices of their ancestors, because the profession is elevated to the status of a kala or an art, and therefore there is a certain degree of sanctity that is imputed to it. I know of several Muslim sculptors who adopt Hindu practices during the sculpting period because that is what is expected of them. In stark contrast, in certain states, like in Tamil Nadu, what they have done is that sculpting has been reduced to a 1-year certification course, that the entire way of life has gone to the dustbin. Nobody knows what they are talking about because you have reduced an entire way of life to one certification program. This is where an art or a vocation or a profession is reduced to a career or a job. So in terms of contemporary relevance, I would say those people who subscribe to those ways of life, leave them alone. Just as you wouldn't want your way of life to be interfered with, you have no business interfering with their ways of life as long as it doesn't affect you. You may have perpetually offended notions or offensive notions with respect to caste. That's your problem, that's not their problem. If you're willing to leave the Jarawas of Andamans alone because you believe that they're not supposed to be interfered with, it's perhaps the last remnant group in terms of protecting that particular way of life, why wouldn't you want to extend the very same benefit of doubt and the very same position to others? Because you have chosen to ride the hide horse of a casteless society on a regular basis. So whether it will make its presence felt once more, I don't know. I really have no idea. But this much is clear. You have tried, everybody else has tried, caste is not dying. It won't die, period. You have only entrenched that identity across the board. It has only gone from 50% to 69% to 76% in certain states. So all you can do is cosmetic changes. Road के नाम से जाति को हटाओ, लेकिन certificate में पक्का डालो. The Dravidinous nonsense does the very same thing. They don't want to recognize that the Chodars were Devas, because apparently that's casteist. They don't want that. But election के time पे आपका arithmetic किस पे बैठता है भाई? Caste blocks के ऊपर बैठता है. So I don't think, at least I would want to hear about a casteless society coming from the blessed mouth of a politician. आप रख लो, please zip it. It's not important from you. So whether its value will be fully recognized and so on and so forth, okay, let's ask a much more uncomfortable question. How many people today will have the discipline and the rigor to practice all the obligations that come with following that particular way of life? From V1 to V4, let's see what happens. Because it's not an easy obligation at all. It will start with the investiture ceremony. Daily, the Nitya Karma becomes a regular part of your schedule. Dietary restrictions. You can't eat outside. Which is exactly why chowdhuries were built in temples and other places for different communities to cater to their dietary restrictions. And all we can see there is Brahmanism and casteism, when in fact it was meant to cater to different dietary restrictions. Ask all these questions, it will open a can of worms. Answers exist, it's just that we don't have the stomach to stomach those answers. Next. Yes.
Namaskaram, sir.
Who was asking?
This side, sir.
Raise your hand, please. Oh, sorry. Please.
Namaskaram, sir.
Yes.
I'm Nishant Vidyarthi. I'm an MA German student. I'm an activist, like environment activist in our campus in JNU. And my question is, what should be the Hindu approach to political agitation and solution for the environment or Mother Nature? Like, is there any plan of action for this? And why can't we have more environment activists so that the narratives are not to be imported from the West, like Greta,
Because I think in the Hindu mind, or at least the conservative Hindu mind, environmentalism has been entirely outsourced to the left, unfortunately, to their own detriment. You don't take a particular issue seriously, someone else is bound to. Now, whether they are doing that to protect environment or whether they are using environment-based communities as weapons against the rest of the Hindu Dharma is for people to ask. So here's what happened. So I think when this Char Dham highway and all that was being discussed, and I think the road widening of Uttarakhand was being discussed. Problem is, even those who were clearly practicing conscious Hindus, when they said road widening in such an eco-sensitive region for non-defense purposes will lead to more commercialization in a fragile eco-space, were being accused of being communists. So the discussion has now come down to these stupid binaries. I can't be a practicing Hindu or even a Hindutvavadi for that matter and also say nature and Prakriti are an important part of Sanatana Dharma. That lesson needs to be told to the Hindus first, more than anybody else, because they seem to have divorced it in their heads. So that is effectively the Christianization of the Hindu belief system, where Prakriti no more features in your scheme of things. There is one thing, so in the book I have clearly said, one is to convert the Hindu, the second is to Christianize Hinduism. What has happened since 1857 is the second category, which is even more pernicious, which is now you look at everything about yourself through the Christian lens. So whether this practice is rational, whether this practice is modern, why on earth are you insisting on using the word modern? Do you understand its connotations? Do you understand its origins? It has a very clear colonial anti-indigenous slant to it. Don't use it. So I think in my limited, let's say, interactions with the public, I've said, a strong temple ecosystem translates to protection of the environment around in terms of the ponds, the lakes, and the let's say the forests around it, and forest-based communities around it. I've given some examples. How certain mathas depend on tribal communities exclusively for their, let's say, for the wood that is needed to keep their kitchens burning, without resorting to modern kitchenry, so to speak, to ensure that there is a livelihood there, there's a continuity here, so on and so forth. Are there any PhDs in this country actually focusing on the relationship between a strong temple ecosystem and conservation of nature? Maybe you should seriously consider one of those topics. There is enough to research on. I am giving anecdotes, but I don't think even my position is as rigorous. My first principle position may be rigorous, but the empirical evidence is shaky because I don't know beyond this. We need more research on this. Standard go-to topics when it comes to speaking about Hindutva is conversion, religion. I think they are very important topics. But look at the other issues as well. Your agenda is primarily negative or other oriented. Let it become positive. Which means, what can you do on the education front instead of constantly crying about it? What can you do on the history front? What can you do with respect to the discussion on gender identities before it succumbs to woke garbage? That's the next massive, vast, let's say, export from United States, which you must be extremely wary of. It's even worse than radioactive uranium, because it's going to kill every societal structure within and teach us about how to treat the non-binary gender identity. Come on, don't teach us. We have deities who are actually in that particular Tritiya Prakriti. And there are communities and spaces where they're protected. All of that will be repackaged with a lot of anger. And the standard Marxist oppressive trope, and will be told, no, this is all about, from caste-based patriarchy, it will now translate to gender-based, let's say caste-based oppression, it will now translate to gender-based oppression. I would genuinely hope that our to-do list expands. I have enough to do already, man. How much will I do? See, whatever I have, my limited role has been knowing fully well how the other side operates. Yes, there is another side. If this translates to otherization, I'm sorry, it already exists. That is the reality which I live in. I know how it operates in my fraternity, so nobody is in a position to pontificate me about otherization. So, Since that exists, how do you make sure that you have a very clear positive agenda? It's not in the interest of scoring brownie points to the other side. It is in the interest of protecting the way of life which you claim to be fighting for. But if you're constantly interested only in this tutu meme with the other side, then you're missing out so much which is under the radar. You're only scratching the top soil of the surface, you're not going below that. That is largely also the consequence of looking at this particular concept entirely and purely from the political lens. Decoloniality, dharmic civilizationism should not and cannot be outsourced to the state entirely or to the political apparatus. It is a societal, let's say, construct. If the society changes the way it looks at things, it will throw up political options which also look at things differently. Which means the next time you have an EIA assessment, an environmental impact assessment before, let's say, a project is started, you'll ask better questions. I genuinely don't believe that the current EIA model, especially after the changes that have been undertaken, is good for environment. It doesn't matter who's in power. What is wrong, especially if it affects nature, because you'll be penny wise and pound foolish and it'll come back to bite you maybe 15 years later or 20 years later. If the Himalayan water table or let's say that entire ecosystem is affected in any way, the better part of the Gangetic plain right until Vindhyas will be affected. It doesn't matter who says it. If that is the reality or that is the projected reality, you might as well be bloody careful about it. In an institution such as the JNU, I would hope that there is some research on this. And that way, apart from, let's say, taking back and reclaiming the space that has been ceded to anti-nationals, take it back but with a very positive agenda, with rigorous research, both in terms of archival research and primary data. That's what I would do. Next.
Good evening,
Take
sir.
two more questions and then, yes, please. Yes.
मेरा नाम मुकेश भगत है और मैं यहाँ पे CHS में JNU में.
CHS is what?
Center for Historical Studies.
Okay, okay.
तो मेरा क्वेश्चन ये it's about merit, idea of merit. Somehow India में कुछ जॉब चाहिए तो there is only one exam and there is only one pattern of conducting exam. So जैसे कि इंडिया एक डाइवर्स कंट्री है, so सबका बैकग्राउंड अलग अलग होता है. Somehow when there is one exam, ये एक तरीके का एक मैराथन रेस है और सबको लगता है कि सब एक जगह से स्टार्ट कर रहे हैं, पर सब नहीं कर रहे हैं.
ठीक है.
तो मतलब there is caste, there is class, there is gender, there is also about social upbringing कि आप किस जगह पैदा हुए, कैसा social background है, अगल बगल वाले क्या बोलते हैं, क्या सोचते हैं. And और ये क्वेश्चन के साथ मैं आपसे ये भी सवाल है कि कैसे कि जो आदिवासी कम्युनिटीज इंडिया में वो सबसे ज़्यादा somehow because of their way of life somehow वो इस जो रेस में सही से पार्टिसिपेट नहीं कर पाते. In the sense कि उनका जो वे ऑफ लाइफ है वो इसके कस्टम नहीं है कि तुमको ट्रेन नहीं करता इस एग्जाम के लिए.
जी.
तो मैं चाहता हूँ कि आप इस क्वेश्चन को आंसर करें, साथ ही ये भी सोचें कि जो आदिवासी कम्युनिटीज है इंडिया में वो समहाउ सही बैठते नहीं इस एग्जाम, मतलब इस पैटर्न के लिए.
ठीक है. I think I broadly agree with the spirit of the question. I would only disagree with the use of the word Adivasi that was coined by the missionaries and the British to perpetuate the Aryan invasion theory myth. I will never support it. Because Adivasi and Mool Nivasi effectively means that there is a fundamental difference between all these groups. That's where I stand on that issue. Okay. Why don't you give the mic to him? I'd like to discuss with him, please. I would genuinely believe, and I'm not putting you on a spot, a genuine belief is that you're more informed and smarter than at the very least the above average politician in this country. Fair enough?
Thank you for that.
आपके हिसाब से इस डाइवर्सिटी को अकोमोडेट करने का तरीका क्या हो सकता है, मुझे थोड़ा समझाइए. एंड दैट टू फॉर अ कंट्री ऑफ द स्केल ऑफ भारत, ये आप कैसे करेंगे, थोड़ा समझाइए. रिजर्वेशन अगर आपका सॉल्यूशन हुआ then you see where the conversation will go. Let me try and perhaps address this question differently. Do you have an answer to the question?
Yes, sir.
Okay, बताइए. क्या करें बताइए?
डायरेक्ट आंसर तो नहीं है
जी,
बट आई गेट कि रिजर्वेशन के
फील फ्री टू spitball and come out with suggestions, no problem, go ahead.
तो रिजर्वेशन सबको प्रॉब्लमेटिक लगता है और इसमें क्वेश्चनेबल है, बट मैं ये चाहूंगा कि इसके जगह में एक ऐसा सोल्यूशन आए जिससे ऐसा हो कि जो पीछे छूट गए हैं उनको और ज्यादा आ जाए, ठीक है, मतलब आउटपुट और अच्छा होना चाहिए, यदि कोई बेटर सोल्यूशन हो।
आपने सोल्यूशन के एक्सपेक्टेशंस बता दिया, सोल्यूशन नहीं बताया।
यस, मेरे पास कोई खास प्रॉपर सोल्यूशन तो है नहीं।
That's okay. So let me-
बट मैं ये चाहूंगा कि जो सिलेक्शन प्रोसेस होता है
जी जी जी,
वो केवल एक पैरामीटर पे ना हो,
ठीक है,
कि देर कोई एक एग्जाम ना हो, मतलब केवल एक ही एग्जाम पे सिलेक्शन ना हो। समहाउ आपको ये भी देखना पड़ेगा कि वो जो सामने वाला कैंडिडेट है वो कहाँ से फाइट करके आ रहा है। ऐसा जरूरी नहीं होता है कि मैराथन में दौड़ने, मतलब जो 1 किलोमीटर दौड़ता है वो शायद कैपेबल नहीं है कुछ नहीं करने के लिए,
ठीक है,
शायद उसके सर्कमस्टांसेस उसको 1 किलोमीटर ही दौड़ने के लिए कैपेबल या अफोर्ड करने लायक बना पाता है। तो समहाउ वी हैव टू सी कि कौन कितना दौड़ रहा है और ये भी देखें कि वो कहाँ से दौड़ते हुए आ रहा है,
ठीक है,
तो उसको भी फैक्टर इन करके हम सिलेक्शन कर सकते हैं। तो आई थिंक मेरे को लगता है कि अलग अलग पैटर्न्स में होने चाहिए एग्जाम, केवल एक ही पैटर्न से, मतलब यूपीएससी का केवल एक ही एग्जाम होता है, तो 4 यूपीएससी होना चाहिए।
तो पेरेंट्स के सैलरी के बेसिस के हिसाब से क्या अलग अलग लेवल के एग्जाम्स रख लें?
या मतलब
मिडिल क्लास के लिए एक एग्जाम, अपर मिडिल क्लास के लिए एक एग्जाम, सवर्णों के लिए एक एग्जाम, कैन वी डू दैट?
उसमें भी प्रॉब्लम
I'll tell you where the problem is. Just consider this for a moment. I come from a low middle class Tambram family, so feel free to hurl all sorts of labels at me, which has known nothing beyond mechanical engineering until my generation. Engineering may be sirf only mechanical, literally nuts and bolts. Okay. When I made the transition to law, in my profession I have to compete with people whose fathers and mothers are judges or bureaucrats. I come from the Andhra State Board, not the CBSE. There's a very clear distinction in the English skills, social grooming skills, social graces, the social strata of both these groups in Hyderabad. Okay? State syllabus and CBSE are very different categories altogether. From localities you can identify कौन किस स्कूल में पढ़ता है और कौन से बोर्ड में पढ़ता है. Okay, you can identify all of that. Plus, if you happen to have a father who is in the profession, the legal profession, you will get 3 benefits, or mother for that matter. Why be patriarchal? Okay. So, one is a legal library which is bloody expensive. Medical books and law books are very expensive because they function on high margins of sale because the volume of sale is less. Several books are 1.5 lakhs and 2 lakhs and they must be barely 300 pages or 400 pages. So that's a library. Second, an office space. Okay. Then an established set of clients from your parent, whichever parent it is. Assuming that both parents are heterosexual or maybe it's a non-heterosexual group. Okay. So when that happens, I have 2 options. Keep crying in the system. इसके पिताजी ऐसे हैं, इसके माताजी ऐसे हैं, मैं लूट गई बर्बाद हो गई. Okay, I can do that. Or take unfairness as a reality of life. And that these are the cards that life has dealt. And no matter what, you want a standing example, you have an Irfan Khan and you have Jitendra's son. Okay? I don't even know that poor boy's name. Okay? I am saying, inevitably, those who come without any kind of support system end up developing a certain reed ki haddi and a reality check on a regular basis that holds them in good stead in the long run. I'm not saying we can't do better and insofar as the system is concerned. But I will never agree with a system that pampers the society, that protects you from the hard blows of life. You will protect lallus and bablus and pappus. No, it's not a jibe at any politician or youth. I'm genuinely saying this, that I think this is one of the consequences of the socialist argument of equality of outcomes. You're hoping to somehow equalize outcomes. And you're also saying, even if a particular opportunity is presented to 6 different people, since they come from 6 different backgrounds, it's not equality of opportunity. What are you going to do? Recalibrate their entire lives before they got that opportunity? Or can you be absolutely sure how they'll use the opportunity after it's been given to them? I think you're playing too much with the element of chance and with the element of probability, which is what I think defines life significantly. At least 60% of your success is not attributable to your talent. It is attributable to the opportunity, the stroke of luck, or somebody just seeing you and saying, okay, let's give this person a chance. How much are you going to equalize? It is going to produce a set of yellow-bellied, weak people who constantly expect to be protected from competition, and competition will never be fair, it will never be equal. If that is the kind of expectation from, let's say, your society in terms of internal competition, aap khak ladenge China se. Global realities are not going to deal with this. So what is the next level of this argument? Reservation of the private sector? That's the only space left. That's the only space left. We are inching towards it thanks to what has been said in the EWS judgment. I'm someone who's spoken partially in favor of why reservations can continue for a certain period of time until there is a replacement, and I've given certain replacements. At least I've presented them as proposals. My point is, this will gradually move towards the argument kaise crystallize hoga. Let's accommodate for people who come from backgrounds which are non-English speaking. Let's accommodate for people who come from low middle class backgrounds. Let's accommodate people who come from a rich background but who don't come from an educated background, because rich is not the same as being educated. How many permutations and combinations are you going to account for in this? What kind of triangulation are you going to resort to? Don't encourage this. It's important to go through that pain. I'm not a sadist, but that pain is what translates to your ability to deal with certain situations. That the trial by fire and that rite of passage is a part of growing up. The industry, no matter how much you equalize, will find a way to accommodate the blessed word that Delhi worships, jugaad. आप इसको eliminate कहीं नहीं पाएंगे, क्योंकि किसी ना किसी का किसी के साथ कोई relationship होगा. Because everybody who gets out of the car here says, जानता हूं मैं कौन हूं. How many जानता हूं मैं कौन हूं will you accommodate? Right? Realize that nature is not horizontal. Nature has a chain. It may not be strictly vertical, it may be circular, but it may be circular in concentric circles. That means there is a hierarchy even there, whether you like it or not. Don't shield yourself from hard realities of life, because when you do it, at the very least, 2 things are going to be affected. The overall quality of people that you produce as a society is going down, and the overall quality of professionals will also go down. So, I would say, try and make the system more, let's say, robust from a human intervention perspective, कि इसके साथ कोई बाहर से छेड़छाड़ नहीं करेगा. At least give me that. Which is to say that jugaad will not work beyond a point. I'm okay with privilege working, I'm not okay with jugaad working. There's a difference between the two. Which means what you've inherited by way of, let's say, of a certain family, or because of the circumstance that you've been born in a certain family, that can't be reset. But when I deserve to get that opportunity and in the final stage somebody chooses to take it away because there's a jugaad connection working somewhere, perhaps that can be reduced or eliminated to some extent. Beyond that, I don't think it's possible to do so much. And in a country like India, how much are you going to do like this? How many layers are you going to create? How many slices are you going to create? Not possible. Next. Final question, please.
Hello,
yes,
sir. This side.
This lady has been waiting for a while. Yes, please.
Good evening, sir.
Yes, please. We'll come back to you. Yes.
Sir, my name is Rupal and I'm a research scholar in School of International Studies in JNU.
Yes, ma'am.
Sir, I want to ask you what, according to you, is history? And maybe while answering that, can you please also comment on E.H. Carr's conception of history?
Whose conception of history?
E.H. Carr.
Sorry?
E.H. Carr.
I plead ignorance.
Okay, sir. So then, what is history according to you? And what is the role of history? And what is politicization of history?
Okay, so if you were to go with our own definitions of itihas, then say it for what it was is the first, let's say, duty of a historian. Which means if you were to take both our epics as itihasas, which they are according to our conception, no character is glorified at the expense of the truth. Where a certain aspect of the character deserves to be glorified, it is, but the grays and the pitfalls are also shown. So I think first is history needs to be true to reality is one, but its role, strictly speaking, is to give us certain relatable examples in terms of whether such a situation has arisen in the past. In which case, how do you deal with it? Again, I'll go back to my profession and give you an example. Lawyers depend on precedents to make an argument. What is the purpose of it? Which is that in a similarly placed situation with respect to a similarly placed party, can we have a similar outcome? Is the principle of precedent. That's called the doctrine of stare decisis. So, history's job is to also help you show the way forward, but history's job is also constantly hold a mirror to the mistakes and to the pluses or the minuses that you may have committed as a society. If history's job is to constantly airbrush the mistakes that you've committed, you will never learn the lessons that you're supposed to. Societies learn from their past in terms of what they can take forward, what is worth taking forward and what is not worth taking forward. That's one role of history. Politicization of history can be for multiple reasons. So in a recent summit debate, Sri Pawan Verma and Sri Saman Khushi effectively said that the Nehruvian dispensation fashioned a certain version of history to protect peace after the partition. Even if the goal or the intention is noble, and even if it is projected as being noble, I don't think you have any right to tamper with history. And that's one of the reasons I believe that history in the hands of any politician will be subjected to political triangulation and approximation. And one of the things that I also happen to say there is that perhaps the business of putting together history should come out of the political realm and must enter the societal realm where you have an independent body of people along with societal participation to comment on what is it that we want our children to read and understand. So, notwithstanding the noble intentions that you may have set for yourself, noble intentions have paved the way to hell in the context of Bharat, where whitewashing of history has led to a situation where the aggressor gets to deny the existence or the occurrence of a particular genocide altogether. Altogether. It's one thing for me to forgive and move on and also hope to forget at some point. It's another thing for you to deny it altogether. So denial of history is the direct consequence of political whitewashing of history, which should never be permitted under any circumstances because it takes away the right of a victim to say, you have done this to me in the past. I'm not asking for an eternal victimhood complex, but I'm certainly not going to be in support of someone who denies a Holocaust altogether. That must be a punishable penal crime, which it is in certain other jurisdictions. We are being told that the average Kashmiri believes that nothing happened with Kashmiri Pandits and Hindus. How can that even happen? If the roles were reversed and the communities were reversed, would it have been allowed? We are being constantly told of Gujarat and Godhra on a regular basis. Why can't we have the same right when it comes to what happened in Kashmir? Why does the principle of logic altogether become completely different merely because the roles are different and the communities are different. So, history also has the ability to tell you what is it that you want to do in the future. And that comes from understanding what you have done or you shouldn't have done in the past. No matter what we do, almost every question that was raised in today's session has had something to do with history. Not one question has been independent of history. So at the very least, its value, its relevance cannot be denied. It cannot be dismissed. People want to be objective, they are rarely objective. So historians say उम्मीद करना मुश्किल है, but the only hope that you do is that every, let's say, profession has certain rules to ensure some kind of consistency, to ensure some kind of objectivity. So I'll explain how this works. So you have principles using which a statute is to be interpreted, with every judge will have to abide by. But does it mean that two different people applying the same principle to the same provision will come to the same conclusion? तो फिर वकील की जरूरत ही नहीं है. There are no two different interpretations possible, right? Because somewhere your subconscious bias is going to work, because you are trying to arrive at a conclusion which you think is the right conclusion, and your conscious mind is constantly creating arguments to reach that particular conclusion. That's effectively how the subconscious and the conscious mind works. That's exactly why it's called confirmation bias. You may not know it, but you've ended up arriving at the same conclusion, and you feel happy about the fact that you've reached a conclusion, and some of the words lend support to your conclusion. Otherwise, how is it that a 3-judge bench says something, a 5-judge bench says something, a 7-judge bench says something, everybody keeps changing? Then shouldn't law be the same as mathematics when it comes to its outcomes? It's not. Yes, go on. It's truly the final question, because I have briefings to attend, I have hearings tomorrow. So this is not billable, that is billable.
So,
yes.
So as the last question of the day.
Let the lady have the last question of the day.
Okay.
Yeah. Mike, please. You are rendering the female community voiceless here. JNU, what are you doing? Julus nikalo, jalao kuch.
Thank you so much, sir.
Yes, please.
Hello, sir. Jai Shri Ram.
Jai Shri Ram. That's the voice of an empowered Hindu woman. Please, go on.
Sir, this is Nidhi Sharma from Indian Institute of Mass Communication. Sir, my question to you is that we are now seeing mass conversions to a new faith altogether, or let me put it this way, a new ideology called Navayana Buddhism. And those 22 vows of Ambedkar show nothing but hatred towards the global minority, that is Hindus.
Right.
So do you, and ये politically भी politicians इसको support कर रहे हैं, so happening openly, blatantly हो रहा है. Do you consider this a fault line? If so, how detrimental it is for the civilizational cause in the long run?
Extremely detrimental, a very dangerous fault line. And that's not going to be addressed as long as the subaltern discourse is not democratized, and we have more and more voices being showcased both from history and contemporary society who are proud Hindus despite sharing the background of Dr. Ambedkar. The unfortunate reality is that entire discourse has been, let's say, essentialized at the feet of one particular individual. I am not going to say that this discussion has no space for this individual, but this was not a monolithic discussion by any yardstick. There were enough Hindus who came from the very same background, who were extremely proud of both their Jati identities as well as their Hindu identities. Rarely have we been, let's say, shown their histories. They don't feature in our discussions on history whatsoever when it comes to caste-related issues. So hopefully, as part of some of my, let's say, writings in the future, I genuinely hope to bring out those realities as well and leave it to the audience to decide what is it that you wish to subscribe to. Because the very same vows, if they had come from any other person outside the Hindu fold, would have seriously attracted both 295A and 153A. It's one thing to say I'm making the transition to something else. But before doing so, if you start spewing venom on this particular community, well, this community also has rights under the law. But the problematic part is it's an internal divide, and it's a huge divide. So the fault line, to answer your question, is extremely dangerous, and it needs to be addressed as soon as possible. But again, someone like me who goes with facts, I would want to go with more facts on this particular front. So I'm sure people have noticed this transition gradually in my own position. My position with respect to Dr. Ambedkar in 2015 was something different. Over the last 7 years, with improved reading and with exposure to more literature, I have changed my positions. I've openly said on a television debate that Dr. Ambedkar is a mixed bag who needs to be understood in his entirety. Some parts you can certainly agree with, but there are some parts which are difficult to agree with without denying his personal experience or whatever is it that he may have been subjected to. I am not denying his personal experience, but your personal experience cannot be projected onto scripture, because scripture is a matter of fact. It's a matter of reading. Experience is a matter of personal feeling. Assume for a moment, you and I have a fight here, and assuming that you were a student of JNU, you said something. The fact that you said something to me which spoiled my experience here will be a reality. Would it be fair on me to get out and say, this entire institution is like this? Would that be fair to the rest of the people who are listening calmly? That's exactly what I'm trying to say. Then you'll have to change that position. Aapko change karna padega. It has to come to mean something else when it comes to its connotation about this institution. So, my point is this. To deny somebody's personal experience would be to be insensitive. I'm not doing that. But I will never let that become the darpan or the lens through which I look at my society. Because it's such a vast society with its own local, let's say, realities. Can anybody realistically say, when diversity has been the repeated subject matter of discussion here, that caste reality is the same across this country, given its diversity? Are the power structures the same? No, they are not. Does V1 to V4 interact in the same way or occupy the same top to bottom positions across the country? No, it's not. Has that been the case in history all the time? No, it is not. So, that particular aspect of the Hindu discourse needs greater democratization and more diversity. That much I'm clear about. I would want to talk about Ramana Maharishi. I'd want to talk about Narayana Guru. I'd want to talk about so many people who have stayed within the fold and who have created models to ensure that people move up the ladder as opposed to saying, let's finish the entire system altogether. If someone says that the only way to deal with the caste problem is to destroy the Hindu culture and the Hindu society and the Hindu religion as a whole, sorry, I'm not with you. I won't be with you under any circumstances. Thank you.
Before I give formal vote of thanks, can we have a great round of applause for Mr. Deepak? मैं हृदय से कृतज्ञ हूँ जे साई दीपक सर का, जिन्होंने वक्ता के रूप में अपना बहुमूल्य समय आज हमें दिया। मुझे लगता है कि मैं यह बात समस्त जेएनयू छात्र समुदाय की ओर से कह सकता हूँ कि आपका सानिध्य पाकर हम धन्य हुए और हम आशा करते हैं कि आगे भी आपका मार्गदर्शन हमें यूं ही मिलता रहेगा। मैं धन्यवादी हूँ हमारे सभी सदस्यों का, जिनके अथक परिश्रम के बिना आज का यह संवाद संभव नहीं हो सकता था। मैं विशेष रूप से आभार व्यक्त करता हूँ अखिल भारतीय विद्यार्थी परिषद की जेएनयू इकाई का, जिनके समर्थन के बिना यह कार्यक्रम हुआ ही नहीं होता। अंत में मैं हमारे आज के सभी श्रोताओं का आभार व्यक्त करता हूं कि उन्होंने अपने प्रश्नों व उपस्थिति से इस चर्चा को सार्थक बनाया। वाल्मीकि अध्ययन मंडल समय समय पर ऐसी चर्चाओं, अध्ययन व पठन कार्यक्रमों का आयोजन करता रहता है। आप हमें जानें, आप हमें समझें व हमसे जुड़े, ताकि जेएनयू में प्रचलित विमर्श के भारतीयकरण में के हमारे ध्येय की ओर हम अधिक प्रखरता से बढ़ सके एवं भारत विरोधी विचारधाराओं का जड़ मूल से नाश कर सके। धन्यवाद।
वंदे मातरम हेतु सभी अपने स्थान पर खड़े हो जाएंगे। वंदे वन्दे मातरम् वन्दे मातरम् सुजलां सुफलां मलयज शीतलां शस्य श्यामलां मातरम् वन्दे मातरम् शुभ्रज्योत्स्ना पुलकितयामिनी फुल्लकुसुमिता द्रुमदर शोभिनी सुहासिनी सुमधुरभाषिणी सुखदां वरदां मातरं वन्दे मातरम् कोटि कोटि कंठा कल कल निनाद कराले कोटि कोटि भुजय धृत कर करवाले अबला केनो माय तो बले बहुबलधारिणी नमामि तारिणीं रिपुदलवारिणी मातरं वन्दे मातरम् तुमि विद्या तुमि धर्म तुमि हृदि तुमि मर्म त्वं हि प्राणा शरीरे बाहुदे तुमि मा शक्ति हृदये तुमि मा भक्ति तुम्हारे प्रतिमा गढ़ी मंदिरे मंदिरे मातरं वन्दे मातरम् त्वं हि दुर्गा दश प्रहरण धारिणी कमला कमलदल विहारिणी वाणी विद्यादायिनी नमामि त्वां नमामि कमलाम् अमलामतुलां सुजलां सुफलां मातरं श्यामलां सरलां सुस्मितां भूषितां धराणीं भराणीं मातरं वन्दे मातरं वन्दे मातरं। भारत माता की जय।